Hello me lovers, and we are going to talk about propagation today. So propagation is a word you have probably heard a monumental amount of time in the houseplanty world. We're going to talk about it. I'm going to show you how to propagate your houseplants. Propagation is mainly used to create new plants, but it also can be used to save some plants too. We're going to dive deep into the very classic way of propagating houseplants, which is with some scissors or a clean knife and cutting the plants into different pieces. However, there are some plants that have very special ways of propagating, and we're going to dive a little bit deeper in later in the video, so stay tuned for that one. To propagate our plants, we're going to need a pair of scissors or a really nice cutting knife. These scissors or knife will have to be sharp. A cleaner cut when propagating your plants means the cutting is going to be a lot healthier and probably have a better success rate in the long run. These are my trusty scissors. I keep them sharp all the time. They are a little bit dirty, so you could probably do a better job at keeping your scissors clean than me, but these will do the trick for our propagation. The plant I'm going to demonstrate our propagation techniques on is this pothos marble queen. I find in my experience pothos is one of the easiest plants to propagate, and to be fair, a lot of other plants do follow in being easy to propagate too, but I think for demonstration purposes this is really easily to show you what is happening and what I am doing. When we talk about the anatomy of the plant and we speak about nodes is a critical point on the plant where roots, stems or leaves grow on the plant. On a pothos it's kind of easy to tell, and I would say most plants it is easy to tell. There are some plants that might be a little bit trickier. The best thing to look out for is to, on your plant, find where the leaf is growing out of the stem. You may notice some nubbly bubbly roots or maybe longer roots growing out of the node. This is going to mark the point where we are going to cut our plants. When we are cutting our plants to propagate, we want to cut below a node. Cutting below the node will stimulate the plant to then start producing roots. Once we have a healthy root system on our cutting, we can then plant this up, and that would be a successful propagation. When we feel comfortable that we can identify where a node is on a plant, we can start propagating our plants. We are going to want to get our handy scissors or cutting knife, and like I said, we're going to cut below the node. So this stem here, I can see 1, 2, 3, 4 nodes. This is potentially 4 plants, and we're going to cut each one. To start off the stem, we're going to cut below this node like so. Now we have our stem. We're going to cut up for the individual plants. So in between here, and there we go, we have one plant there. So let's cut up the rest. So now we have cut up our individual pieces. We now have 4 potential plants that we can grow from this propagation technique. I'm going to show you the different types of ways we can grow on our propagated plants to get that healthy root system to then pot on eventually and be a whole new plant itself. One common way of propagating plants, like my monstera here, is just to simply put your cutting in some water. Now we don't want to submerge the whole plant in water. We just want to make sure that node is in the water. The plant will then start to realize, oh, I'm in the water now, I better start doing something, and it should burst into growing some new roots. Here's a little example of my monstera cutting that has been growing in water, and you can see these new roots growing off this aerial root here. I would typically wait until I see a relatively healthy root system. I don't want to repot this cutting quite yet with a tiny root like that. I want to see a good 3 to 4 inches of root first, almost to the point where the roots are taking over the water. That way I know the plant is stable, it's actively growing, and I know by repotting it, it would then have a better chance of survival. Here is an example of some cuttings that are probably ready to be potted on. As you can see, there is so many roots on this cutting. I know if I pot this, it's going to be happy and healthy and be a stable cutting once in a pot. So I'm looking for a really tangled root mess before potting on a cutting that is grown in water. Another way to grow on your cuttings, and actually my favorite way of growing on cuttings, is by putting perlite in a jar. Now this is an empty mayo jar. I have filled this up with perlite. I then will add water to about 2/3 of the jar. It is very easy. You just stick it in and it will grow. So this is an example of a cutting growing in perlite. This is a Sphagnum chiapense. As you can see, it is growing loads of roots. I really like this method because it feels like there is some sort of substrate the plant can kind of become attached to, as well as still keeping air in between the roots. I have had the most success with propagating in perlite. Everybody is different, everybody has their own way, but this is my favorite way. I have had the most success. We're gonna get our pothos cutting. And again, we just want to just pop that in underneath the perlite level. We don't want to put the whole cutting in there. We just want that stick with the node in there so the node wakes up and grows those roots. Another way we can grow on our propagated cutting is by using sphagnum moss. Now you might see something called a prop box, and people make these propagation boxes where the surface is full of sphagnum moss that is moist but not soggy, and you'd leave your cuttings on that. I have had a few prop boxes, but I also do it in this way, which is a plastic cup full of sphagnum moss, and I just place the cutting down the edge of the cup. This is an example of a Scindapsus that has been propagated with sphagnum moss. It's been relatively successful. I do find this method more or less as successful as perlite, but to me perlite is still a little bit of my favorite. As long as you are keeping the moss moist, not letting the moss dry out, this way can be very, very successful. This method of using sphagnum moss does require that little bit more attentive care, so you're trying to keep the moss moist at all times. So anyway, we are going to get our little cutting. We are going to just place it down the side of the cup like so. Again, we just need that node covered and surrounded by the lovely moist moss for it to wake up and grow some roots. So I'm going to put it back in the cabinet under a grow light and wait for some roots to grow. Another method of propagating and growing on your cutting is putting it straight in soil. Now this kind of method isn't my favorite. I think this method can lead to more problems. However, it can be quite successful in some plants. This is a cutting of a Monstera still Pancana, and I did just place it down the side of some soil. I can't really take it out because it has rooted itself inside this soil. So it has been successful for this cutting. However, I do tend to see sometimes cuttings rot a lot easier when they are grown out this way. For the sake of this video, we will take pothos cutting and we're just going to place that down the side so the node is just covered with the soil, and hopefully see some. Now we are at the part of the video where I want to throw a little curveball into propagation with a couple of species of plants that have a unique way of being propagated, and that is a begonia and a peeler. Now there are other plants that have really interesting ways of being propagated, like most succulents, but I wanted to show you these two because they're very similar in how you would do it. Begonias can have a lot more ways of being propagated than a peeler, but I wanted to show you the cool, interesting ways. First of all, I would recommend getting yourself a tray or a tub with moss. This is already a prop box for some Philodendron Miamis in here, and they are starting to grow. There's lots of little growth points on these sticks. I would recommend doing it this way with moss for these kind of propagations. I think that this way has the most success, or a tray with perlite. You can get a peeler. This is a peeler peperomia leaf like this, and you literally could just place it in the soil like so. You'd start to see little plants growing around this section of the plant itself. If you want more chances of propagation, you can cut this leaf in half. So we have our two sections. This can then just be placed upright in your prop box. Now, this is a very, very similar technique to doing this with a Sansevieria. What you'll start to see is along the edges of your cutting, loads of little new baby plants will grow, which is incredible in how you propagate this. And it's the same with a Sansevieria. It's really, really cool. Strange. Biology is weird, but it works. This is kind of similar to a begonia. A begonia you can cut up into chunks and it will grow from each of the section. You can place the leaf in the soil and let it grow like that. We're going to make some small incisions in the veins of the begonia leaf, and where you make incisions is where the new plants will grow, which is really, really cool. With a knife, or if you can delicately snap it across like so, without it coming apart. And then we're going to put this crinkled, snapped leaf just on our moss like this, and we should see some little plants growing in each little crease. If you want to do it precisely, I would recommend using a knife, cutting little slits and not across the whole leaf, but this should work too. So I'm going to put my lid back on my little propagation tub and set them aside under a grow light and see what happens. So now we have talked about propagation, what it is, how to do it. You're going to become addicted to cutting up your plants and making loads of props, making loads of new plants, and maybe giving them to friends and family too. I want to set a little challenge for you, me lovers, and go ahead and try and do a little propagation experiment and let me know your results down below and how you get on. Until then, I will see you on the next video. Bye, me lovers. Bye.